All right, we're back with the newest episode of We the Individuals Live, where we believe in the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. I'm Anarchris. I introduce myself like once every 4 weeks, so I'm going to remember to do that this week. With us, as always, is Jeff Peterson, the founder of We the Individuals, and fellow admin Andy Catherman. And with us tonight, our guest is Samuel Grinney. He is in charge of the Utah chapter of Millennials for Bernie. So we're going to have a discussion about Bernie Sanders today. If you've watched some of our older episodes, we've talked about Bernie before, but this time we actually have somebody on that's going to be able to provide some counter arguments. So we're excited about this. Samuel has a degree in philosophy from what college did you say?
Utah Valley University.
Utah Valley University. So we've been talking about Aristotle right before he came on. Good conversation. So hopefully, I know we really appreciate you coming on because obviously you're outnumbered here. We're not going to agree on things, but I think we're going to be able to have a fun civil conversation, and that's what I'd like to see from all of them. I'm mostly talking to my guys here, of course. No throwing punches at each other. So let's open up with the basic one. Why, Samuel, do you support Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, I mean, it's a basic question. It's a complicated answer. I think
Sure.
first and foremost is going to be, well, I mean, I would take it from two places that are the most important to me. Economically and foreign policy speaking, I mean, I think that over the last decades we have made continual missteps in foreign policy. We've created a huge amount of problems abroad, especially in the Middle East, where obviously we've had a much greater interest in being involved. And I think, I'm not 100% with Bernie on all his foreign policy, but I think he's the only guy that is serious about saying we need to get out of our foreign involvement. We need to stop pretending like the United States' military can solve problems for other people abroad, and we need to withdraw and start, paying attention to our own internal struggles. And then second to that, economic, I mean, it goes everywhere from environmental. I think that he is the only one that's strong enough on the environment and what we need to do to combat, climate change, all the way down to economic justice. I think his views on economic rights, on people's rights outside of, as they're outlined in the Constitution, that they go beyond that to economic rights as well. I think that that's very important, and it's essential. It's a cornerstone to our ability to build the modern society we've been creating.
Okay, so on foreign policy, I think most people are going to anticipate we're generally going to agree on foreign policy. I absolutely agree with what you said in general
Mhm.
terms. And I know these other guys too. The United States doesn't need to be policing the world. So I think our challenge there, and we'll start there since you brought that up as your first point, is it's not that we disagree with your view on foreign policy, because we
Mhm.
probably don't. It's that we don't think Bernie Sanders is really the anti-war guy. I'll give you my favorite example when I talk to anti-war leftists or anti-war socialists that I think I brought up the last time we talked about Bernie Sanders was Eugene Debs. I always tell people I would vote for Eugene Debs. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So he's one of my favorite historical figures. He ran for president on the Socialist Party ticket from jail because he was thrown into jail for speaking out against World War I. Now that to me is a guy who is so absolutely, emphatically, and sincerely anti-war that he's willing to. He refused to plead innocent in his court case. So even though he's a socialist, I think the foreign policy issue is so important that I
Hmm.
would vote for that guy if I were going to vote at all over any of the politicians today. I
Okay.
don't think Bernie Sanders is that guy. Why do you think he is better on what makes him better than these other establishment candidates on that
Yeah.
issue?
Yeah, so let me say too, I don't think he's that guy either. I don't think it's fair. I mean, he loves Eugene Debs himself, but I don't think that the comparison works straight across. And
Right.
obviously, foreign policy speaking, I mean, there's no way that he comes close to that. He's for me, he's weak on Palestine. I mean, he's weak on Israel. He doesn't do what I would like to see in terms of that. But why
Mhm.
is he stronger? I mean, I don't even need a positive argument. I would start with the negative. Look at the competition. I mean, maybe Rand Paul you could talk about as
Yeah.
being similar in terms of anti-war interest, maybe even more dramatically. But besides that, Hillary Clinton is a war hawk who has been funded by, the industrial military complex for her entire political career. She will absolutely get us involved in the next conflict. We'd have boots in the ground in Syria right now if she had been the Secretary of State when that occurred. So, um, I mean, on the Democratic side, that's not even hard. Martin O'Malley, whatever, he's polling 1%, so I don't even think it's worth talking about him. And then on the Republican side, I mean, again, you can talk about Rand Paul, and maybe that's the only argument for someone like you if you want to vote solely on foreign policy. That's the only other person I could see even comparing with him. But the positive argument that I would go to is, one, the Middle East. I think he's been very clear that we should not be in there militaristically trying to solve this problem. We can happily help Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries create a coalition that can battle this. But Saudi Arabia is the third largest defense budget in the world, and there's no reason we should be taking the front seat in this conflict, especially when you can very clearly draw, the roots of ISIS to our own involvement in that region. So I would say that his stance specifically on what he wants to do regarding Syria and ISIS are a lot more clear-cut to me than any of the others, and a lot less militaristic alone. But do I think that that he is emphatically anti-war? Period. No, I think that he considers war as still a necessary tool in the toolbox of a U.S. president.
So you think it's not so much that he holds the positions that you'd like him to hold, so much as that he's the lesser of the evils, at least on foreign policy, the lesser of the evils. Because I think that's what a lot of libertarians are saying about Rand Paul, and I don't disagree with them. I'm just not willing to vote for him more on ideological views on voting, but I think that's how a lot of libertarians view Rand Paul. Andy, do you have, I know Jeff's not much of a foreign policy guy, but before we move off of foreign policy, because I'm a little disappointed at how much we agree on what you just said, honestly. Disagreements are way more fun than agreements. Andy, do you have anything else on the foreign policy issue? You're a little more knowledgeable than me and Jeff on this stuff.
Yeah, that I would just kind of ask, because it sounds like Samuel and us, we're probably more in line than we think we are.
At least on foreign policy, certainly.
But if, again, maybe as to what Bernie Sanders' foreign policy would be like, as far as what's a guiding principle for that? What is it like a UN-based force for spreading, Wilsonian democracy, or is it a regime change? Is it like a humanitarian benevolence type of foreign policy? Like, hey, there's a genocide going on in Darfur. Should we therefore then deploy troops? What would be a guiding principle, you think, to Sanders' foreign policy?
I would say non-involvement. I mean, I think he's, I don't want to say an isolationist, because I think he still fully wants to participate in a global economy, and even participate in the United Nations, and even have a role, I think, in helping to build coalitions when dealing with things like ISIS or problems in other countries. But I think his guiding principle would be non-involvement in terms of our actual boots on the ground or drone usage, military involvement in foreign countries.
What about bombing campaigns?
Again, so I mean, and I want to separate too. There's a difference between a man running for president and a man once he's elected to president of the United States. You're still capitalist imperial boss of the world when you're elected, and he will still be in charge of dictating American policy and trying to maintain American hegemonic dominance on the globe. That will still be a thing. So what will that look like when he gets into office? No, I wouldn't be surprised if he continued to do limited bombing strikes. I don't know. I would hope that he would discontinue the drone program entirely, but foreign policy is one that I think becomes a much more difficult once the person elected actually assumes the White House.
Right. Well, I think it's like Barack Obama getting the peace prize before he'd really done anything, and then he becomes like he basically extends the Bush policy, if not kind of going further. So I guess one follow up would be, like, let's take Syria. Let's take Assad. Do you think a Bernie Sanders would be like, he's elected president and there's all these people in Congress saying, hey, we have to depose Assad, we need to overthrow him? What would you think a Sanders response would be to that type of policy?
I think a Sanders response would be absolutely not. It is not our place to overthrow foreign dictators, foreign rulers at all. I think he would say, if there is a civil war occurring like there is today, if there wasn't the civil war and it was just a dictator, I think he would absolutely not be interested in involvement at all. Say a civil war exists today that is causing global problems. I think what he would do is go into the Middle East and try to build a coalition using the existing military structures there and make it so that they are fighting their battles.
Okay. So it sounds like I like your position on it. I think it's a good place to start because it does show where we do have some overlap in beliefs. And if I can summarize your position, just tell me if I'm wrong before we move on to economic issues, which I expect to be much more interesting. You're saying, yeah, let's cross our fingers and hope that he's more anti-war than he's campaigning, but realistically, he's probably not as anti-war as he's campaigning, so we got to take him as the lesser of the evils. And I mean, I think that's a fair position. Yeah.
Foreign policy-wise, I would say I think that's the only fair way to understand him. I mean, for me, the big telltale sign is his votes with Israel and Palestine. I don't know how you guys stand there, but I don't care, what other. I mean, I do care what other positions he takes, but the fact that he is willing to vote so in favor of Israel time and time again shows me that he's not fully anti-war and he's not fully anti-oppression when it comes to foreign policy.
Libertarians are generally divided on the issue of Israel and Palestine, but I know Rand Paul lost a lot of his, he started off with a lot of his dad's supporters and lost a bunch of them when he kind of backpedaled on the Israel issue too. He got real popular when he said, let's cut off funding to Israel, and then he kind of backpedaled and said, maybe let's keep funding Israel, and a bunch of people just said, okay, goodbye, Rand Paul. So yeah. I know. Generally, our position is we're anarchists. We don't want an Israeli state or a Palestinian state. We don't want any state, but we know that America shouldn't be involved in it. So we're probably going to predominantly agree on that issue. Okay, so let's move on to funner issues, stuff that we can argue and disagree on. Let's talk about economics. So one of the things that came up in our discussion before you joined us was minimum wage, and I know all three of us have very strong opinions on this issue. So one of the things Andy brought up that I'll pose to you is this issue of a fair wage. What is a fair wage? How do we set it? Why is that the particular wage? And why isn't Bernie Sanders paying his interns that wage?
So, I mean, the intern question we can go back to if you want to.
We don't have to. That's just my cheap shot.
Yeah, no, I understand, and it's worth noting. But a fair wage, I mean, you can't just set an arbitrary price. The basis for what I would say the minimum wage needs to be is that someone working full time is not living below the poverty line, and that is not the case in America today. So I think economic rights include that if you are a full-time laborer, should include that if you are a full-time laborer in this country that is contributing to the American system on a full-time basis, you should have the ability to live, an American lifestyle. There should not be working poverty in this country. I think that to me is insane.
Okay, I've got responses I'd like to make, but I bet Jeff is just chopping it on this one. Jeff, what do you have on this issue?
Well, it's actually a question. It's more of a question on minimum wage. Let's say, for instance, that the minimum wage is. I'll just set up a hypothetical scenario. Let's say the minimum wage was $8 an hour, and I'm producing and bringing in $10 an hour. The company that I'd be working for is going to be making money and earning a profit. Now, let's say the minimum wage was $8 an hour, and then it's actually then raised to $15 an hour. If I'm producing only $10 per hour, if I'm only bringing in $10 per hour, and it's then raised to $15 per hour, you're increasing the cost of labor. How would you expect businesses to stay, at least, especially smaller businesses that typically liberals are trying to help? How would you, by increasing the cost of labor like that, how would you expect businesses to stay in business by increasing the cost of labor like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so the first thing I would say is wages have been flat for 40 years. So where has been the increase in wages when you see increases in inflation, when you see increases in wealth in those who own businesses primarily? So there has been we have seen economic growth, and we have seen no matching of wages to match that economic growth. So when you're saying that you're making $8 an hour but producing $10 an hour in goods, well, I can't say specifically what any given laborer is producing for their company, but what I can say is if 30, 40 years ago they were able to make $7.75 an hour and produce enough value to make that worth it, and they're still making that today, there is an excess of value that they have created over that time that is being taken by someone else. So there has been an increase in economic fortunes, and yet their wages are stagnant. So they are producing more than they were, 30, 40 years ago. The second point I would say is the value of their labor is going to be based on the value of the products they produce, which in part has to do with the demand on those products. So when wages for the middle and lower class, which is the majority of our country, increase, you have an increase in consumer power. You will see more money going into our economic system because they will spend more, and that then increases the value of the products.
So, well, there's 2 points I want to jump in on that, but I'm glad you brought up the issue of inflation because I think that's a point that I like to make about the minimum wage from our perspective, the capitalist perspective, that I think goes overlooked enough. So inflation is a valid issue with that. When wages are stagnant and we're inflating the currency, the effect is to lower wages, what we call real wages in the economic world. And so that's kind of the battle in the minimum wage issue, and this is something that free market economists are going to point out as well, is we raise the minimum wage, and then we inflate the currency, which essentially is, in effect, lowering the minimum wage back down through inflation, which makes it null and void anyway. But inflation does lower the cost of living. So from our perspective, we would say, well, we don't need to raise the minimum wage because it does have deleterious effects on unemployment. And I guess that's kind of my second point is we are seeing that in like Oregon now, where people are closing businesses and losing jobs because of the spike in minimum wage. But could we not kind of have the same effect that you're going for without dealing with the problem we're worried about by fighting against inflation, which really since the Ron Paul revolution, libertarians have, we don't shut up about the Federal Reserve. I get annoyed by it, and I hate the Federal Reserve. So wouldn't that be another way to tackle this?
Yeah, that's another issue that needs to be addressed too. What I would say is going to the point that as you increase minimum wage, it's going to increase inflation. Yes, that's true. And but the problem for me is then there would also need to be an alternative solution to ensuring that what people are being paid is enough for them to maintain a decent standard of living, because it's not a solution to say we just can't raise the minimum wage because that will drive inflation, because there hasn't been, correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I can tell economically, there hasn't been a natural balancing out of wages for wage laborers, for hourly workers. They're just, I don't know what the alternative is to raising the minimum wage if the natural progression of things hasn't shown an increase for these people.
Yeah, well, our argument, and I'm going to go to Jeff because he's got a question, but our argument would be, of course, the gold standard or gold-based currency ever since we moved away from precious metals to a purely fiat currency like we did in the 70s. That's when it happened, because when we had a gold-based currency, wages kept up. And that's one of the things we love to point to. $1.25 minimum wage back when the dollar was coined in actual silver weight would be something like $20 an hour now, and that would be true without minimum wage legislation. So we do believe that people should increase their wages over time. We just believe that this can occur naturally through the market. But let me go to Jeff before we derail on this too much.
Before I go to my actual point, is that you mentioned what other alternatives there would be to actually increasing the minimum wage, and some other things would be is that removing so much compulsory non-productivity that we have. For instance, the minimum wage is an example. Then you got barriers to entry like occupational licensing. Then you have like the Federal Reserve. If you remove those barriers to entry, then you're going to increase productivity. Increasing productivity increases the increases the supply, and then your purchasing power goes much further. But one thing that I was going to say is that what you mentioned on consumption is that, correct me if I'm wrong, and based on your answer, I had a statement to make. But did you say that consumption is what kind of the demand drives the economy? Did I understand that correctly?
What I meant is when there's more money in the pockets of the working class, of the people who are the majority driver of our economy and of consumerism, that means there's more spending into the economy, which then will create more jobs.
Okay. Now the one thing is that from what I know about Austrian economics and Keynesian economics is that is this assumption that spending or consumption drives the economy, I would argue, is false, because while consumption and production is a reciprocal cycle, it's not the case of a chicken or the egg. People can't consume what does not exist. A thing needs to be created before it can be sold. An iPad needs to exist before a buyer can go out and demand one. In the beginning, a person needs to sacrifice, work harder, go with or without, and take loans, which are available because of other people's production, so they can raise the level of their productivity. If you're producing goods that others find valuable, they'll be able to trade and be successful. The increased amount of production lowers prices for others and allows greater consumption. And the reason why is just because, in general, every product is in competition with every other product in the marketplace. So usually it's actually production, which is actually what is more of a factor, as opposed to actually consumption and spending and demand. Is that production comes first, and then it's demand that follows.
Because I want to give Samuel the last word on this and then move on. But what he's saying is, by producing more, we're lowering the cost of goods and therefore raising the standard of living through the avenue of production rather than the avenue of wages, which we're after the same goal, which is raising the standard of living. We just want to see it by producing more. Samuel, I'll let you respond to this, and then we're going to move topics.
Well, I actually just had a question for you. So you mentioned the gold standard, the return to the gold standard helping to balance wages. So we were on the gold standard in the late 1800s, right? The Gilded Era. Mm-hmm. So, for me, that represents the greatest period of worker exploitation in American history. So it might help with inflation, and it might help with, I don't see, though, how that will actually affect the exploited working class. When we're talking about the people who don't have any ownership over their means of production, I don't know how. Explain to me how gold standard would help maintain there, and how that played a role in what happened in the Gilded Era.
Well, I would explain how exploitation is the definition that we'd have to argue, because people did make a lot of profits. And forgive me if I'm imputing this on you and inferring it improperly, but exploitation in a Marxist sense is essentially what we would call profits. When you're making profit, you're profiting off the surplus labor. That's a view we would outright, of course, but the phenomena that you have to answer for when you're talking about exploitation is the workers' standard of living increased at a very rapid rate in the 1800s. In fact, where we had, I think, less than 3% of our workforce unionized compared to Europe, which was much more heavily unionized, our standard of living in the United States was going up at a much higher rate. So, and that's what the Austrian view is profits to us aren't exploitation. They're evidence that resources are being more efficiently allocated, because resources have to be coordinated somehow in an economy, and what we say is the free market is going to allocate them more efficiently, and the people who allocate resources efficiently are going to make profit. So we're of course going to have ideological views on profits and exploitation, but what we're always going to point to is, whether you think it's exploitation or not, the real effect was a raise in the standards of living for the middle. This was the creation of the middle class and the upper class. Everybody, rising tides rise all ships, I think is.
But what was the effect on inequality?
I could care less about inequality.
Yeah, but
everybody's doing better. Oh yeah, here's my answer to inequality, I guess. If I make $10,000 a year and you make $20,000 a year, there's an inequality of $10,000 a year. And if the economy does better because we're producing more and both our incomes double, we're both better off, but the inequality of our income just went from $10,000 to $20,000. I don't care about inequality. What I care about is, did our standards of living rise? And that's exactly what happened in the 19th century.
Yeah, so let me say I do care about inequality.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah, and so let me say, logically, absolutely, I think that you're right. Rising tides raises all ships, Objectively, maybe somebody should be happy if today, I'm able to have an iPhone and all my consumer goods, even if I am living in a, greater amount of inequality to those that are very wealthy in my country, I still have all of these goods. Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's been shown is that's simply that's not how human psychology works. That might be well and good monetarily that might be true on paper, but the reality is we have just as much violence and societal problems driven today than we did in other eras when we had a greater amount of people starving and dying on the streets. We live in a country today where there's a great amount of hunger, but it's pretty hard to starve to death in this country right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can get food. We have done a pretty decent job of providing that, and yet we still have areas like Chicago that is the most dangerous, has been statistically the most dangerous city in the Western Hemisphere, on and off, year after year. So for me, the evidence doesn't bear out that it's all about how much money each individual person has. It bears out, do people in the society feel like they are being treated equitably in the system they are participating in? And if people don't feel that way, if they're looking around them and they see people who are so much better off than them, and they don't have a way to believe that that can be them, right? They don't believe or in the social mobility of their time. I'm not phrasing it well, but if they don't believe it's possible for them to become that, and they can see the vast existing discrepancy between them and that themselves, and that, especially when you work 40 plus hours a week, sometimes, you know, two income earners in a household most of the time these days, it doesn't matter how much total money you end up with. It matters that you are having your face rubbed in the fact that you are poorer than the other people in your society to that drastic of an extent. I don't think inequality itself is always a problem, but I think when you see it in the drastic levels that it's occurring in our society, it is a huge driver of societal problems and violence across the scale.
And let me, I guess, just end off on one sentence before moving to Andy, because he has a question on this issue. I actually don't disagree that people perceive inequality as a problem. I think that's a given. I think most of the reason we even have these discussions is because we would like to show people that inequality is itself. It shouldn't be the goal. The means should be the goal, because the means towards inequality can be bad. Like the old Roman system where they're taking land from the poor people by making them go into the army for 6 years. Well, that was an era in which the rich got richer and the poor got poorer for reasons that libertarians would disagree with. But the inequality wasn't the problem, and from our view, the inequality wasn't the problem. The problem was the means that created the inequality. And I guess that's what we want to attack, because if inequality comes about through what we would call voluntary interaction and, you know, rising tides rise all ships, then we're not concerned with inequality in that sense. But that may be a different and ideological view, so I don't want to spend too much time just debating that. Let me go to Andy. He's got a question on the issue.
Yeah, sure. Just a few points on inequality, because I do think it's a pretty significant issue that Bernie Sanders brings up quite a bit. And so a couple things, like, do you accept the fact that, you know, there is, when we say these people are these people are unequal, like here are the top 1%, here's the 99%. You do realize over time people move between those brackets, right?
Oh yeah,
like,
but that's
when you're in college.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. So when we say, oh, these people, like the rich, or this percent has this much of the wealth, but that's not like they're remaining there for forever. I was in college. Yeah. I was poor. In the fact that I had to work, and had bad hours and everything. But when I graduated, I was able to go to a different tax bracket, or a different income bracket, if you will. So maybe you accept that. The second thing is, I think inequality is only an issue if we're dealing with a fixed pie, because you're like, you have 10% of the pie, I have 20%, but now yours is growing, or mine goes from 20% to 25%, so that means that yours is going to go from 10 to 5. So I think maybe if we don't think of the economy or just income in general as a fixed pie, I think that inequality kind of loses its distaste. And lastly, I think the inequality issue, if we can kind of wrap that back with the minimum wage, I would agree with you. Like, there's lots of, as Jeff said, there's lots of different rules, regulations, barriers that do keep people down. Like, you were talking, what's the unemployment rate for young males? It's through the roof.
Astronomical.
And I would think that something like the minimum wage, if you really are for a more opportunities for people, something like the minimum wage is an exact wrong answer, in my opinion. So maybe see what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, let me jump. So I did a poor job of explaining my inequality piece, but absolutely, I don't mean to say inequality alone is a problem. Inequality can reach any length, and as long as there's enough social mobility, it doesn't matter because people can see that they have the possibility to reach any level in there. The problem that I would say is that we don't have a reasonable level of social mobility right now, especially amongst certain classes. I think when this topic has been studied extensively, it bears out that as inequality has increased, it has been through a lot of times nefarious mechanisms because we have seen a decrease in social mobility amongst first world countries. I can't give the exact quote. The Spirit Level is a book on this that did a really good job because they studied it from an epidemiological perspective. It's not economic, they're not socialist, they're not any type of anything. They're just looking at it as how this is affecting society as a whole. And they show, that we're like 12th or 13th among first world nations right now in social mobility, and we're not leading the nation in the world in creating that possibility for people in the lower and middle class to believe that they can reach the upper echelons.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, I guess the means would be what we're always going to circle back to, because we would not disagree with that, because we like to watch Economic Freedom Index, and that's exactly what popped into my. You said we're 12th or 13th. I think we're something down to like the 18th on certain Economic Freedom Index, but we've been dropping over time, and so that's going to be what we'll cycle back to, is the means are different, and the social mobility, I think, more than the inequality itself, would be a symptom of the problem, and then we'd have to dive deeper to get to the problem. But I want to move on. I want to move on just because, we only have a limited amount of time. We're halfway through the show, and we've got other issues to talk about. Specifically, let's talk about free college. So here's the point I'm going to challenge you on. Bernie Sanders says that the college degree is becoming like the high school diploma. In other words, it's becoming worthless. I agree with him on that. But then his solution to this is to give college for free, which will create more diplomas, which will make, when you have more of something, it becomes worth less. And so he says it's worthless, so I'm going to make it more worthless as a solution. How do you respond to that?
Okay, so a couple of points. First, I think that the real value of a college education, yes, so there is going to be the value of it versus those who don't have it. And that's what we're discussing when you say more people are getting it. It's watering down the total value because there's nothing special about me when I enter an employer and have a degree versus someone else.
Let me interject for clarification. Would you call this another one of the equality pieces then, in that sense?
Explain that further.
Like, as in, by giving more people giving more people access to a college degree, it's about creating a greater degree of equality because you don't have the people with degrees with a greater benefit.
Okay. Yeah. So I think if right now at this stage we're to say we need to be limiting who gets degrees because if everyone has one, it will lose its value, then yes, that's already becoming selective and problematic. But what I would say is I think the biggest devaluer of the college education right now are private institutions that put forward meaningless, valueless, worthless degrees into the marketplace just based on their ability to exploit the federal loan program or whatever. You have the University of Phoenix. You have these private online educators that produce valueless degrees that have absolutely, when you take that anywhere, it doesn't in any way reflect that you have an ability in the workplace to do something. So that, to me, is what is undermining to the greatest degree the value of college degrees. So first of all, I think what Bernie's doing is going to address this problem, which is huge to me, and I think it's been also one of the biggest drivers of the increase in college education. Secondly, I would say that yes, that is also just true, as you have an increasingly educated populace. There was a time when a high school education set you apart from other people. That's no longer the case because we created a K through 12 that we started very successfully rolling the majority of our population through. As that educational threshold increases, so does the need for people to have an opportunity to succeed in the economy. So yes, if we bump that up to an associate's or bachelor's degree, then that will mean less individually. But what that will mean is for those who need a more valuable degree, you need to now move on into higher levels of education. I think what can go hand in hand with this too is, which obviously isn't a major part of Bernie's platform and is a very hard thing to accomplish, but what I think is the case is it doesn't, if you could redefine our K through 12 system, you could come up with something a lot better that would produce something very similar to the associate's degree you already get when you're 18 to 20, just out of your K through 12 education. But obviously that's not on the table right now.
Sure. I can imagine, so there's a lot of things I want to say to this, but I can imagine some of the stuff that Jeff's going to say as response. So Jeff, let me go to you first. What do you have to say?
Well, I'd say that as far as anything regarding public education is that, I think that when, and this is in terms of any sort of a, public education, is that my biggest problem with any sort of public education is the same thing that I have with socialism, is that, the economic calculation is going to be needed for the provision of education.
Explain what you mean by that, because even most modern economists haven't read Mises' essay on economic calculation.
Economic calculation is the process by which individuals determine what is the most cost-effective and productive use of resources. To Samuel, if you may not know that concept was first outlined by Ludwig von Mises in his in the 20s article, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. In that vein, it becomes clear that despite any good intentions of the teachers, administrators, and bureaucrats that make up a public school system, the success of such an operation essentially is based on luck. Should we spend our money on textbooks or more teachers? Which textbooks are best? Should we build a new school or expand the facilities we have? Spend more on arts and technology? So that being said, it's any type the monopolized compulsory public school system where students are forced to attend and money is attained via taxation as opposed to tuition payments has no way to ferret out the best configurations in that regard. It's a private market system that can do this. So I would say that's really one of the core problems with any sort of public education system, be it higher education or public education K through 12.
So to summarize, because I think you're making some of the points that crossed my mind, is obviously, Samuel, you mentioned K through 12, and you used the words very successfly, and I went, oh man, I think it's been completely unsuccessful. I think it's been a disaster. I'm a big advocate of homeschooling. I know most, or at least many libertarians, are an advocate of homeschooling because we see homeschoolers perform, and they're outperforming public school students left and right. They're doing very, very well. And so what Jeff is saying is this is because, and Jeff, jump in if I'm misrepresenting you, this is because a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. don't know how to best allocate what we need to educate people in Kansas City based on, are the textbooks out of date? How do we allocate these resources in a way that's going to better educate people? And so now we're saying is, from our perspective, of course, is that this has been a disaster in the K through 12. We really haven't seen a great increase in test scores since the Department of Education, but we've seen a great increase in cost, and now we're wanting to take that model into the college system, and how can we expect better results?
Yeah, you're right. I think you're exactly right. As such, a public schools and subsidized school system is guaranteed to fail and becomes worse. Now, for one thing, you allocate your own resources a lot more carefully than you allocate the resources of others, or more carefully than you would if you could. But whenever people do a cost-benefit analysis before spending their own money. But in the political sphere, even like the Department of Education, people can't even comprehend the concept of worth it. If they consider something good in politics, they don't even count the zeros in the price tag. But the most important part is that politicians lack even the knowledge to allocate resources effectively. So
regardless of good intentions, they're just they're not omniscient. They don't know. So anyway, I want to hear Samuel's response.
So very first, let me say, when I said very successful, I was using it in the terms of how well we have done at getting large percentages of people through the K through 12 system.
Okay.
I don't mean testing outcomes. I don't mean whether. I think we have a very
that's an important clarification
system. Yeah. So what I mean is that we have increased the average rate of intelligence to what we're able to produce in K through 12. Whether we could create more intelligence using those years, whether we're doing that maximum efficiency? No, absolutely not. But I would contend absolutely we have been incredibly successful at increasing literacy rates in our population, at increasing mathematical comprehension overall. Like, whereas we have had problems, and we do have massive problems in our public school system, we have also created a system that does move a large amount of our people through educational standards they might not have otherwise went through. So, and then to address the private schooling point, again, 100%. Yeah, if my parents kept me at home to educate me, they would have done a far better job intellectually than what my public education could have done for me. There is no debate about that. My problem with undermining a public school system is that not everyone has the resources to go out and find best educational practices. The whole point of a public education system is that it's going to make sure that everyone is receiving the same opportunity, and that there is at least a base standard minimum of what people are getting in terms of, education and what they need in order to succeed in our economy. So I think charter schools have an important role to play too. I think that there's been shown to be some great successes with charter schools in supplement to existing public school. What I would say is, if you destroy the public schooling system, yes, you might be able to make it, we might have leading education system for those select people who are a part of that education system, but there will be a percentage of our population that doesn't have access to that. To me, that's what capitalism has borne out over and over again over time, is that it is going to be selective who receives which goods in capitalism.
Okay, well, I think you have a moderate position in that, because obviously we believe in the full free market effect. That's what we're going to believe. You're not going to change our mind. We're really... Andy, get ready to take a drink. We're really dogmatic on that issue. He has to take a drink every time I say dogmatic or Josiah Warren. We've been doing that since episode 1. But I know a lot of people on the left actually oppose charter schools. They oppose things like, and I may be inferring this, but it sounds like you would support homeschooling more than some of these people. And so I do think that's great. Even though that's not my ideal, that is actually what I think would improve upon that. So we're going to find a little bit of agreement there at least.
Yeah.
I want to give you one little statistic just to see if you believe me on it, and then Jeff has a response as well. But would you believe me if I told you today Massachusetts is the highest ranked public school system out of any state in the country, and they were also the first state, I don't know if you know this, but they were the first state to pass compulsory attendance laws. They passed this in 1850, and so this was before the federal reform of public school under Woodrow Wilson of the Department of Education under Carter, but they passed a compulsory attendance law. Would you believe me if I told you that the year they passed that law in 1850, we actually had in Massachusetts a higher adult literacy rate than Massachusetts enjoys today?
That would blow my mind, yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely true. But of course, what was the alternative to then? It would be most comparable to our homeschooling. So if you're in favor of homeschooling as an option, then we can agree that that is a good, viable alternative to public schools. So let's end on go ahead.
I'm in favor of the option of public schools. And let me say with charter schools, I'm in favor of them as long as what I have seen to be true continues to be true, which is charter schools have done a wonderful job from what I can tell in not being selective about who they accept and actually accepting across demographics and across standard of living. So with that being the case, then absolutely I'm all for it.
Okay, let me get a last word from Jeff on the issue since he has a comment on it.
Well, I think he, brings you brought up a point as far as how it would be afforded in a free market society, and I think one of the problems is that, with taxpayer provided services, it actually crowds out private sources, because people are going to actually, they have to use it regardless if they're paying for it regardless if they use it for now, so it crowds out sources. But as far as how exactly private schools would be more affordable, we just look at history prior to state compulsory education, and one of the most fastest growing models I think was believed called the Lancaster model. It was so efficient, so cheap, so effective that schools routinely offered their services for free to poor people because it cost them so close to nothing to do it, and it earned them a great deal of goodwill. The basic idea was that junior students paid to attend and learn the basics, and as they learned and advanced, they earned their keep by tutoring the younger students in subjects they had mastered in exchange for scrip, which was a kind of currency that could only be used at the school to pay for services, pay other tutors, to buy pencils, and so on. So that's, if you look back at history, that's a perfect example how it could be provided to the poor. And then you have certain things with the technology, Skype, you have also Khan Academy, those are certain examples of how, innovation can bring education to even the poorest people in the world.
Andy,
Yeah,
you
can I
have a
just jump in
comment as
real
well?
quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a good segue off of what Jeff was just saying. So I'm a software developer, and I graduated in 2002 from the University of Iowa, and today I have most of what I know right now was self-taught through very, very cheap means of learning and educating myself. And so I would think that we have it kind of backwards, where education costs are skyrocketing and we're getting crappier product, whereas with like very much of a free, open, free market thing like online learning, and especially in the ways of programming and whatnot, or even IT administration, networking, it's very, very inexpensive. You don't even have to get like a 4-year degree these days. If I had to do it all over again, and I was talking to a high school person that's really interested in being a developer, I would really highly advise them not to go to college and to just find some really good focused things on how to become a good software developer or an IT administrator or whatever. And I think that's a good example of there's no subsidizing these things. It's a free, the internet obviously makes the barrier to entry very, very low. If I wanted to start my own programming class and teach, 1,000 people, I could just have this webcam here and fire up some PowerPoint notes and do some labs and everything. That's a really efficient way of doing things. And I think one thing in talking about economics, the way that entrepreneurship works is through economizing, taking something that it takes X to do and finding out how to produce that at X minus Y, and then maybe charging a little bit less than what everybody else is charging. So you get a kind of a lowering effect of what it costs for producing things while hoping to sell and produce a lot more in the quantity. So I'll get off my rant.
Let me give Samuel the
here.
last word on this topic, and then we need to do a wrap-up because we're about 15 minutes from the end.
Well, let me just ask. I mean, honestly, I just would. So I mean, obviously, it's easy to pick out problems in the American education system. It's not hard, especially the public system. What do you guys? What are your opinions on the Finnish schooling system?
I'm not familiar with it. Can you describe the model to me?
It's the most successful. It's a public schooling system. It's the most successful model.
I do know that Finland ranks higher than the United States on the Economic Freedom Index, so you're already winning me over a little bit.
Well, so the Finnish education system is talking about. There are a lot of other factors that have to do with our quality of education. The biggest one for me is pay for teachers, period. I think that if we don't value our teachers and we don't create incentives to have good teachers, again, something for me like education, it's going to go along with healthcare for me. I think that it is too much of a necessary public good. It is too important to allow private enterprise to have its hands at least solely in it. From where I'm standing, I believe that private enterprise, while oftentimes it produces good, oftentimes it creates exploitation and ignores what should be the benefit of the thing itself. So what I'm afraid of is that involving private industry in these things will create incentives to do other things but try to produce what is best for the people. Now, in the Finnish system, they pay their teachers an incredible amount more. They test their students an incredible amount less, and they give them an incredible amount more freedom what they do day to day. They have a huge amount more recess. They have a huge amount more free time. To me, and then to see the vast difference in performance outcomes between the United States and Finland tells me there is a lot more going on here than private versus public in terms of how these things succeed. I think Finland is a great example of how you can create public models for these things and yet have them be incredibly successful in their outcomes.
I'll give you my input because I want to jump off something you said, but I want to get a quick answer from Jeff and Andy on this as well. My position on that, in terms of my ideal, is it's one I get from David Friedman. David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman, if you're not familiar with him, is one of the leading anarcho-capitalist, non-Austrian economist thinkers. And I hold his position, which is, you said healthcare and education are too important to leave to the free market. My position would be they're too important not to. If you were giving me a choice between privatizing the postal office and privatizing the education, it is because I agree with you that education is so important that I would opt to have slow delivery of mail than I would a poor socialized education system. So I would privatize education system because I agree with you in terms of how important it is. And that's going to be, again, just an ideological disagreement. As far as the Finnish model, I would like to look into it more. I know that a lot of the European models, I think, are better than ours. I always say all socialism's bad, in my view, but some socialism is worse than other, and there are some socialist models that are less terrible than ours. I'm not unwilling to acknowledge that intellectually, and I do see that somewhat in Europe, but the only ideal to me is anarchy. The only ideal to me is privatization. Guys, we've got 10 minutes left, so each one 60 seconds. Do you have your own answer that disagrees with me, Jeff and Andy?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Go ahead. Okay, I'll go real quick. My dad is a retired 6th grade public school teacher, so I think I have a little bit to say on pay. And he retired in a very comfortable pension. And so I'm not going to necessarily buy the argument that we don't pay our teachers a lot. I think it is the incentives are wrong, because it's a first in, first out for performance for pay. Plus when you get a tenure. And my brother has his son in a charter school, and they don't have tenure or it's free whatever you want to call it, like at will employment. And if you have really, really inspired teachers that are awesome, yet they're on the bottom of the rung pay wise, that's a problem. And I think that's where I maybe agree with you as far as like, we need to pay our teachers, right, but we need to pay them what they're worth value-wise, what they can produce.
Sure.
Right. Jeff?
It was regarding the Finnish system, and he mentioned a point, which is, this is usually a lot of things I hear from the left, is we need to look towards Scandinavia. But one thing is specifically with the Finnish system is that one of the reasons for having so many universities is regional politics. Politicians buy votes by creating and maintaining government jobs in depressed areas. That's, I think, one of the oldest tricks in the book. And also another point is that the multitude of universities brings in the overall level of education down, because such a small population can't possibly maintain a high standard of education in so many different places. There simply aren't enough competent people to go around, not to mention that many of the universities and polytechnics are located in less than desirable places. And lastly is that higher education is so accessible, it lures thousands of people every year to go for a degree, even though they have no business in the world of academia. This produces a great number of bachelors, masters, and PhDs who don't have any value on the job market because they studied literature or other things. In many cases, they don't choose their major because they actually thought it would give them a job. They chose it because it seemed fun or interesting. So I think there's more to the Scandinavian Finnish model than just meets the eye that therefore they have it, it must be successful. If you look at, they have lower corporate taxes, they outrank us in the Economic Freedom Index. It's easier to start a business with no minimum wage laws as well. So there's more to Finnish in the Scandinavian model than...
So there's the possibility that because they're better in other areas, that actually helps support this area, even though it is socialized, which we could debate all day long, because at the end of the day, that's theoretical. But I think that's, at least from the libertarian perspective, valid to point out, because Finland is I think, top 10 economically free countries. But let's move on from there, because we're running out of time. I want a final broad question to you, Samuel, and then I've got a couple follow-up closing questions that I always do. Big question, theoretically, hypothetically, you are emperor of the world. You get to craft a political system in your image, your idea. You know what ours is? Ours is privatize everything, get rid of government, capitalism abounds. What is your ideal if you had the power to snap your fingers and put it in place?
Democracy, man. The economic system to me should reflect the will of the people. I'm really uninterested in dictating economic policy. I don't think there's any goddamn way that I am right. Like, dude, there's just that's why these debates are important, because it's important to be constantly considering all opposing viewpoints, because each of us is a single experience in this world. So what I'm gonna say is,
Are you laughing at Jeff looking like an alcoholic in the background?
I just lost my train of thought for a second.
He did that on purpose, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was thinking so too. So what I'm going to say is yes. What is important for me is the establishment of a true democracy where the will of the people can be borne out in the government. Other than that, for me, I love socialism. I love the idea of a world that is from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's a beautiful idea to me. Do I think that I am in the position to set that up or be emperor of the world? No way. I'd just like everyone to vote on that.
Okay, well, we knew we disagreed on that coming in, so we don't really need to argue that point. But I like hearing from you, and I agree these debates are important for this reason. So let me get my final question in. I ask all of my, with some exceptions depending on their field, I ask all of my academic guests at least for a book recommendation, even though we disagree. I'm still going to let you recommend to us a book because I like reading stuff I disagree with. So give me, as a libertarian who disagrees with you on so many things, give me a book to read.
So you want me to hit you with the book that will disagree with you, or just like my favorite book of all time?
If you can give one book for me, however you want to answer this.
One book for anyone to read, it's Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche.
It's
Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche.
Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Yeah,
Zarathustra.
I have not read that one, but I know which one you're talking about. I read a little bit of Nietzsche. Everybody thinks libertarians love him. I can't stand the guy. Or at least my professor that assigned him was like, you libertarians didn't like Nietzsche? I was like, no, he's like a jackass to me. But Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. Okay, I'm going to add that to the list. I don't think we'll get these recommendations from our other libertarian guests, so I actually like the opportunity to get a more unique recommendation. But if you're reading Nietzsche, that means we are going to agree on some things, because he was in many ways an individualist, he was an anti-imperialist, he was a civil liberties guy, and even though I take my issues with him, libertarians do have some stuff in common in that mindset. And I think we've seen that in this discussion. Even though we disagree on the solution to the problems and we disagree on the diagnosis of some of the problems, there are certainly some overlaps in our beliefs. So I always like having these discussions so we can hash that out and untangle it. I think it's been very productive. Before we sign off, let me plug a couple of shows coming up. Tomorrow at 9:30, we have Politics After Dark is going to be going over the Republican debate, the reactions to it. It is no fun, in my opinion, to watch these debates because they make me want to shoot myself in the head, but it's kind of fun listening to some libertarians, and trust me, we hate Republicans just as much as you do, so we always like hearing these libertarian reactions to the Republican debate. And then the next day, on December 18th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Jeffrey Tucker is going to be interviewed. Brittany Schaefer, I may be pronouncing that wrong, but it caught my interest because this individual is the author of a comic book where the superhero cannot use violence. I'm a huge comic book nerd, so that, of course, caught my attention. I think everybody should tune into this. You can always learn from Jeffrey Tucker. Until next time, we are not going to be doing a show next Wednesday. We will actually be back. Jeff, is it Sunday the 30 or the 3rd, 4th, something like that? What is it?
It's somewhere around there.
Yeah, it's actually going to be the Sunday after Christmas, or we're skipping a week for Christmas, and then we're skipping
the second.
Week to move on to Sunday because that's when we're going to start doing our shows. We'll get the dates out there before the show, so I apologize for my lack of preparation.
It's the 2nd. He's right.
The 2nd. Okay, Sunday the 2nd, we're going to be back. Same time, different day of the week. And before I go, I want to justify my shirt. I wear my Chase shirt every time we talk about socialism because I love taking a socialist and seeing his face on a piece of privately produced property, sold for profit, because I know that's the best way to give this guy a middle finger. I'm sorry, I have to do it anytime we talk
The
about
irony of
Sanders.
Che Guevara, right?
Absolutely. Samuel, thank you for coming on. I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, and I'm glad to have had you.
Hey, thank you guys. I really did too. I was a little nervous coming in, but you guys have been awesome. Thank you
Yeah,
very
it's
much.
always hard being outnumbered, but I think we enjoyed it. All right, Mike, you can take us
Nice
off
talking to
air.
you, Samuel.
Yeah.
Nice talking to you.